Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Streets of New Capenna Standard Guide. In this video, I will be discussing the format staples, the top tier decks, and the key interaction that you need to be aware of in New Capenna Standard. Starting things off with the format staples, these are the cards that you can find in tons of different decks and that you can expect to be battling with and against all of the time when you are playing this format. Starting things off is Fable of the Mirror Breaker. This is a great 3-drop for red that will make you a 2/2 that can start generating you some treasures. It then lets you filter through your draw and finally makes you another 2/2 that has a very powerful impact on the game. It comes down early and has a massive impact, so you can expect to see this in tons of red decks. Next up is the Wandering Emperor. Whether you are a white aggressive deck, mid-range deck, or controlling deck, you're probably going to be able to find a use for this planeswalker that just has tons of utility for the game, and it is overall a card that you should definitely be keeping in mind when your opponent passes with 4 mana, and a card that you should be looking to slot into your white decks. Next up is Asika's Chariot. It is a card that is omnipresent in green decks because it just creates a ton of stats for just 4 mana. It can take over the game by generating more tokens, and overall gives you kind of a resilient threat as well because the vehicle can be hard to interact with. So Asika's Chariot is a great card for your green decks, and definitely something you need to be prepared for. Next up is Tenacious Underdog, a new addition from New Capenna that is a great tool for creature decks that run black and are interested in having some sort of recursive threat that can also be great on turn 2. So Tenacious Underdog fits that bill quite well and is found in a lot of black mid-rangey or aggressive creature decks. Next up is Goldspan Dragon. This card has been dominating Standard ever since it was printed, and it continues to do so in this current Standard format. It can be used as almost a combo card. It can also be used as the top end for kind of a mid-rangey deck, and is overall just a fantastic card that you will see all of the time in New Capenna Standard. Next up is Luminarch Aspirant. This is pretty much exactly what aggressive white decks are looking for. A 2-drop that can snowball the game and make combat very easy for you and very difficult for your opponents. So when you are playing against white decks, you can oftentimes expect them to have Luminarch Aspirant. And then finally, the sweeper of choice in the format is the Meathook Massacre. This card can be very flexible and can kind of take out the board state based on what cards your opponents have, what cards you have. And so you find this sweeper even in decks that run a lot of creatures themselves, because it can give you a nice little bit of reach, a little bit of a life gain buffer, and overall the flexibility and power of this card is off the charts and makes it found in tons of different decks in the format. Next up, we're going to be talking about some of the top tier decks in the format, ranked in order of how many colors they are to play, starting off with Obscura. This is the white, blue, and black deck of the format. It uses cards like Rafine, Scheming Seer to come down on turn 3, be an evasive threat that's hard to deal with on a 1-for-1 basis that can start filtering you through your deck. Wedding Announcement, which flips into Wedding Festivity, is another card that is very hard to deal with on a 1-to-1 basis, can start helping you flood the board and overall just give you a lasting advantage. Kaito Shizuki, another card that comes down on turn 3. Basically, these turn 3 plays are defining the deck, and it can either make you a ninja that can then start attacking, or it can just start drawing you cards immediately if you have curved out. Here is a example deck list. The goal is to establish board presence and then grind with planeswalkers and resilient threats. And as I was talking about with the format staples, you can see that this deck includes the Wandering Emperor with 4 copies, Luminarch Aspirant with 4 copies, Tenacious Underdog with 4 copies, and the Meathook Massacre with 2 copies. So a lot of these format staples are able to slot into this deck, this strategy, and that is one of the reasons why this is a premier deck in the format. Next up is the Naya Runes deck. This is white, red, and green. And this deck focuses on being an aggressive enchantment synergy deck that can have some truly devastating turns thanks to some of the combos that you can assemble. Jukai Naturalist makes all of your enchantments cost 1 less. Runeforge Champion lets you search for a rune and lets you pay 1 rather than pay for the rune cost. And with both of those cards in play, you can cast your runes for free because Runeforge Champion makes them cost 1, Jukai Naturalist makes them cost 1 less, so you can just start chaining through your deck with runes. And Showdown of the Skalds is a great card draw engine that can even give you +1/+1 counters when you are casting a bunch of free runes. So here is a sample deck list. The goal is to deploy creatures with enchantment synergy to snowball the game. So Generous Visitor is another early creature you can play that grows with enchantments. Kami of Transience does a similar thing. And then as you can see, Fable of the Mirror Breaker does make an appearance. Next up is a Jund, or Riveteers, as it is known in New Capenna, mid-range deck. A lot of the cards in this deck are very hard to trade with on just a one-for-one basis, and overall it's just a very grindy experience, but also has the potential for some very early game pressure thanks to Ob Nixilis the Adversary, which if you cast it on turn 3 and use the casualty mode, it really just puts your opponent under a ton of pressure. Riveteer's Charm can give you some nice card advantage or removal, and then Bloodtithe Harvester can be a very nice 2-drop for the deck and give you a little bit of extra filtering. Here is an example deck list. The goal is to get ahead with a strong curve, and then grind opponents out with value cards. As you can see, Tenacious Underdog making an appearance, Asika's Charm making an appearance, Fable of the Mirror Breaker making an appearance, and the Meathog Massacre. So lots of format staples in this deck, which means a lot of power level in the deck list. Moving on to a Teamer deck. This is a Teamer treasure ramp type deck that is very heavily red-green and then splashes a little bit of blue for a couple of counter spells. So you can think of this as kind of an aggressive deck that tries to get out onto the front foot early and then uses a couple of key counter spells to stop your opponent from sweeping the board or stabilizing. So it uses the classic combo of Jasper Sentinel and Magda Brazen Outlaw to generate lots of mana early, and it even picks up a nice addition in Ginny Faye Jetnir's Second from New Capenna, which lets you create creature tokens instead of treasures once you get to the point where you no longer need treasures. Putting this into a shell with the goal to ramp out strong spells with treasure and keep opponents off balance with counter spells. You can see some of the spells that you're going to want to ramp out include Goldspan Dragon, Isika's Chariot, and Moonveil Regent as some nice top-end threats. You run a couple of negates in the main deck, and then some extra counter magic in the sideboard. And then, of course, you have the format staples of Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Isika's Chariot as nice tools for just being powerful cards that can generate multiple bodies with one card and just overall be very strong for this sort of strategy. Next up is Blue-Red. This can be a more controlling deck, but it can also be more of a combo deck. I'm focusing on the combo version in this video, but there are a lot of control decks that use very similar tools, so you can kind of think of them but also as Blue-Red decks. Some of the key cards are Expressive Iteration, which is just a great way to get card advantage and card selection all rolled into a nice 2-mana package. Lier, Disciple of the Drowned, which is the sort of card that if you ever untap with this in play, you have access to so many cards that you're often going to be able to win the game. And then Galvanic Iteration leads to a lot of cool combos in this deck, specifically with some of the treasure generators, and also like some cards that let you take extra turns or just do some crazy shenanigans. Looking at it in the context of a full list, the goal is to control the early game and set up treasures for a big combo turn. So you're using cards like Big Score and Unexpected Windfall, which are the 4-mana spells that let you discard a card and generate and draw 2 cards and then generate 2 treasures. And then you combine those with format staple Goldspan Dragon, which lets you tap those treasures for 2 mana to essentially have some very, very large turns, just basically casting Goldspan Dragon and then trying to get a Lier into play at the same time, and then just like chaining through your entire deck and combo killing your opponent. It is very cool to play and one of the more combo-y type vibes in the format. Next up is a tribal deck, Black White Angels. It uses the new card from New Capenna, Giada, Font of Hope, to help ramp out into your angels. It can use Righteous Valkyrie to gain you life and also buff up all of your creatures. And then Furious Retribution turns all of your angels into removal spells while also being a nice finisher tool. Looking at the deck as kind of a full list, the goal is very simple: curve out with angels and fly in for the win. It doesn't necessarily have to be the fastest deck in the format, but it does have some very strong like life gain elements as well, so it's really hard for your opponents to necessarily kill you with their aggressive decks. And then it just has a bunch of angel cards, so it is a rather unique deck. It runs a lot of cards that no other decks want to run, but you still do see a couple of Wandering Emperors making the cut. Moving on to a aggressive deck, Mono White is present in this format. It just wants to be curving out on your opponents and utilizing a lot of the creatures in the deck, the fact that they have some sort of way to interact with the opponent. So, for example, Hopeful Initiate at 1 mana can kill artifacts or enchantments if you get enough counters on it. Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, can make it harder for your opponents to cast their non-creature spells. And then Brutal Cathar, which flips into Moonrage Brute, can be a great tool for interacting with your opponent's creatures. Looking at the full list, the goal is to win the game quickly with a great curve of interactive creatures. So looking at some of the other interactive creatures in the deck, there is Elite Spellbinder, which can mess with your opponent's hand, and Redain, God of the Worthy, which can be a nice tool for shutting down your opponent's more expensive spells. It also uses format staple Wandering Emperor and Luminarch Aspirant as just very strong additions to the deck. Moving on to mono green, this is another aggressive deck that uses creatures that are oftentimes oversized for the mana you're paying for them. So Werewolf Pack Leader is a 2-mana 3/3, Old Growth Troll is a 3-mana 4/4, and then you can use Blizzard Brawl as a little bit of interaction to help take out your opponent's threats and keep pushing damage. The goal is to deploy big creatures for cheap and use them to win quickly. So other big creatures you get for cheap, Ulvenwald Oddity, and then you can even grind with Ranger class, and then Invoke the Ancients can be a very big play at 5 mana. It also features Ezeka's Chariot, because if you're playing green, you're almost always going to be wanting to run the Cadillac, as it is affectionately known. Let's move on to the key interaction section. These are the cards that you need to be aware of if your opponent is passing the turn and holding up mana. So at 1 mana, if you're facing a green deck, the card that you should have on your mind is Tamiyo's Safekeeping that they can use to protect a key card, usually run in limited numbers, so not a huge factor necessarily, but out of the board sometimes run as well. Spell Pierce is also a card that can be sideboarded, so if your opponent has a single blue mana, keep that in mind. Spikefield Hazard can be used to deal a single damage, so that can be a key card to keep in mind. And then Ray of Enfeeblement is a card that is sometimes run in the main deck, oftentimes run in the sideboard, and is very good against white decks, and so something that you should definitely be aware of. Next up is the 2-mana spells. These are the removal spells a lot of the time that are used in the format. Dragon's Fire is used frequently, especially paired with Goldspan Dragon, to oftentimes deal 4 damage. Vanishing Verse used in almost any deck that can cast it, just because it is a great removal spell for a lot of the key threats in the format. Infernal Grasp and Valorous Stance are also used in the decks that are those colors respectively. And then, of course, at 2 mana is also where a lot of counter spells lie. You can expect to find Jwari Disruption in the main deck as a couple copies in certain decks. Negate sometimes makes it into the main deck. If a deck is really desperate for counter spells, it'll sometimes run Make Disappear. And then oftentimes out of the sideboard, you'll see more copies of Negate or Disdainful Stroke. Next up at 3 mana, there is the Riveteer's Charm that we already mentioned as a premium removal spell, and then another counter spell in Saw It Coming, oftentimes coming down as a 2 mana Foretell and then being cast for 2, and then Prismari Command as a 3 mana interaction spell that can kind of kill some stuff or generate tokens or be just a useful kind of toolbox card. I do also want to mention Guardian of Faith at 3 mana. It's not really an interaction spell, but it is the sort of card that can come out of the sideboard and really blow out a sweeper. So if you are playing the sort of deck that really needs to stabilize with a board sweeper, make sure that you are aware of Guardian of Faith so you don't just lose the game on the spot. Moving up to 4 mana, we of course have the Wandering Emperor. I just want to keep emphasizing that this is often the card your opponent is going to have if they are passing with 4 mana up. In the Obscura deck, they will sometimes have a couple copies of Obscura Interceptor to just get a little bit of tempo as bouncing your spells back to your hand. And then the Jund, or Riveteers as it is sometimes known, decks, they will have Unleash the Inferno in a couple copies sometimes. And then because Hagra Mauling is a land on the backside, you'll sometimes stumble into a copy or 2 of this card against certain black decks. And then finally, I did want to just mention the sweepers in the format. Of course, the Meathook Massacre is the sweeper of choice. You'll face this card a decent amount, even from decks that aren't pure control decks. But if you are playing against red decks, Burn Down the House is kind of the sweeper of choice to stabilize in terms of like your blue-red control decks. And then Cinderclasm can come in out of the board a lot of the time to deal with those smaller creatures. And then if you're facing a white control deck, Doomscar is often the sweeper they will use just because it can be foretelled early and kind of get into the onto the board and impacting the game by turn 3 if they really need it to. So these are the sorts of sweepers to be aware of. There are a few others, but these are the ones that are primarily played. And anyway, that is going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment if you have questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave hashtag StreetsAhead in the comments section down below. Classic reference to a TV show. And also, hopefully you're going to be streets ahead of your opponent in Streets of New Capenna Standard. I really do hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.